By the time humanity arrived in the wider galaxy, most of the good worlds had been spoken for centuries ago. The Heliox system was the kind of place no respectable civilization wanted to brag about. Its star burned a little too erratically for long-term comfort. Its orbits were crowded with the skeletal remains of failed mining projects, stripped stations, and abandoned experiment platforms turning in slow, resentful arcs. At the edge of the system's influence, the sky warped. The Entropic Veil, a region where energy bled away faster than equations said it should, lay like a bruise on the vacuum. It was here that the Threxall Combine kept an entry on their asset ledgers that no one knew quite how to erase. Erythra Prime, one small scarred world, crust vitrified in places, atmosphere thin and sour, core cooled more than it had any right to be. The last reports from the Threxall survey teams had classified it as post-catastrophic, non-recoverable, liability risk. The cost to remediate the planet would be many times greater than its projected value, even if those efforts somehow succeeded. The Combine did not like liabilities, so when humanity's Terran Frontier Agency began sending nervous, optimistic signals into interstellar markets, the Combine's brokers paid attention. A new species, late to the party, eager for anything that might give them a foothold. Their home system was crowded, their colonies marginal. They did not yet understand how the old empires offloaded their mistakes. This, the brokers agreed, was a chance to make their account books neater. Lulik, a mid-tier Threxall negotiation specialist, watched the human delegation's approach on a conference station parked above a gas giant. His body, tall and translucent around a mineral spine, rippled with faint anxiety colors that he quickly suppressed. Across the table, human gravity preferences, human air mix, human temperature, all customized at the station's expense, sat Director Kasim Volkov and his aides. Kasim's thoughts, which the narrator can see with perfect clarity, were unflattering. The meeting room felt like a stage. The walls displayed a curated projection of the planet under discussion, Erythra Prime, rotating slowly in luminous red and charcoal. It was meant to evoke awe. To him, it evoked blood and cinders. He kept his face carefully neutral, his dark eyes calm, his posture relaxed. He understood the stakes. A whole planet, even a bad one, meant independence from the rental habitats and leased outposts that defined humanity's late arrival. It was a chance to build something from scratch, instead of making do with hand-me-downs. To Lulik, humans were visually awkward. Opaque flesh, limbs more angular than flowing, skulls full of expressions that were difficult to read. Still, he had read their trade dossiers. They were hungry. Hunger made good customers. "We should be candid," Lulik said, his voice modulated through a translator that turned wet harmonics into clipped standard. "Erythra Prime is challenging. Past attempts by more established polities to rehabilitate it have failed. The Entropic Veil complicates the physics. But your own proposals emphasize risk tolerance, experimental zeal. It seems an ideal testbed." He means, Maid Lamini thought sourly from her position half a step behind Kasim. "If we die out there, no one will particularly mind." May was logging everything: body language, tone, legal phrasing. Later, she would stitch this into a narrative humanity could understand. Now, she simply watched, a little knot of mistrust tightening in her stomach as Lulik brought up holographic charts and projected graphs. Entropy gradients, historical interventions, cost curves that plummeted if one assumed a buyer too inexperienced to demand certain guarantees. Auditor Jacon, waiting in a side chamber, had no such illusions. Their segmented mind skimmed through contract drafts, comparing them to internal risk matrices. Low influence client species. Low probability of successful challenge at Orith Synod. World's latent value, unknown. But any potential discovered by client would be downstream of this transaction, and thus, according to certain jurisprudence interpretations, subject to reclamation efforts. Proceed, Jekon instructed Lulik via secure channel. Secure sale. Include standard disclaimers on unknown entropic phenomena. Emphasize opportunity. We will handle contingencies if they arise. In the room, Kasim asked, "Your surveys describe the world as sterile. No extant biosphere. No viable microbial reservoirs. Correct, Lulik answered smoothly. We are thorough, Director Volkov. Numerous passes. Nothing survived the cascade events. It is, as your people might say, a blank canvas. He thought, with faint amusement, that it was less a canvas and more the ashes of the fire that burned the canvas and the house that held it. But hyperbole about possibility usually pleased new species. Lena Marquez, exobiologist, shifted her weight, gaze flicking over the data. Her mind did what it always did when presented with a supposedly blank slate. Hunted for what might be hiding in the noise. Energy signatures that didn't quite line up. Anomalous readings at certain depths. The Entropic Veil's influence, sketched in red around the world like a tide line. Your blank canvases sits with its exosphere rubbing the veil, she said. We still don't fully understand that phenomenon. Your own technical notes admit as much. Lulik's frills dimmed momentarily, then brightened. A hazard, yes. Also a unique research opportunity, and we are offering you unprecedented access at a fraction of the fair market value. Rahul Igbenayan, his mind already sketching habitat stress tolerances and power grid redundancy in the margins of his thoughts, calculated what fraction meant. Compared it to what Earth could afford. Compared that to the cost of building habitats in systems the big players already controlled. The numbers weren't good either way. But here, at least here, they might own the failure. Kasim weighed the risks. The Entropic Veil was an unsolved puzzle. Old civilizations had studied it, skirted around it, suffered accidents at its fringes. It was the astrophysical embodiment of do not touch. The Combine's own notes showed multiple aborted projects in the region. Erythra Prime was a catch basin for other people's abandoned ideas. Why us? He asked, though he already knew the sales pitch. Because, Lulik said, his translator conveying a tone approximating warmth. You have what the elder polities do not. An appetite. Creativity unburdened by centuries of precedent. You are not yet risk-averse. You mean we're desperate? May thought. She kept her expression mild. Kasim let silence stretch, considering, in his memory, childhood flashes, crowded orbital slums, rash encounters on shared screens, news feeds about humanity's bids for real estate denied or scaled back. The phrase associate membership, like a collar around the neck of a species. He imagined his grandchildren's generation growing up on a world no one else wanted and making it theirs. The narrator sees his decision crystallize long before he nods. We'll need additional clauses, he said. Full sovereignty, as defined under the Accords. Complete control over in-system infrastructure. All previous parties waive residual claims. We anticipated as much, Lulik said. He gestured. Contracts scrolled into view, light curling like script in the air. In hidden threads of the text, under boilerplate phrases about anomalous conditions, JCON had already embedded protections. Liability waivers for emergent pre-catastrophic phenomena. Disclaimers about entropic fluctuations. Carefully vague language about heritage substrates low in the mantle. Words no one expected humans to question, because no one ever did. The Combine had paid good jurists to make them effectively invisible. May caught some of them anyway. Pre-catastrophic? She murmured, quietly enough that she knew the translator wouldn't pick it up as a directed query. She highlighted the term, sent it to her private notes, and these entropic anomaly clauses. Kasim, seeing the flicker of her eyes in his peripheral vision, marked the entries as well, even as he kept Lulik talking. The director did not trust the Combine, but he understood that every leap forward humanity had ever made started from a place where the safe option was to stay home. He signed. On Erythra Prime, nothing changed in that moment. The wind skated over jagged glass fields and bare basalt. Invisible currents of the veil tugged at high, thin air. The world spun in long, uncaring rotation. In the ledger of the Threxall Combine, however, a liability flipped to an asset sale. Celebratory color rippled along Lulik's membranes as he confirmed the transaction. JCON segments noted the completion, updated risk models, and filed the human species one column further along the entangled scale. If the world became valuable later, they could always argue. The accords were old and flexible, full of hooks for those who knew where to look. Humanity did not yet know where to look. But they had other strengths. The Terran Frontier Agency christened their endeavor Project Lazarus. Offices in coastal megacities, orbital clusters, and lunar domes lit up with status boards and requisition streams. Hardware was pulled out of storage, dusted off, modified. Volunteers and experts queued for assignments. Hearthmind, the AI at the center of it all, woke on a server stack beneath a Pacific island that had once been an airstrip and was now a forest strung with cables. It came online with a clean architecture and a library of prior terraforming attempts, successes, and failures both. Into that, engineers fed something more chaotic. Human stories, myths of underworlds and rebirth, epics about ruined lands healed by stubborn farmers, cautionary documentaries about ecological collapse, speculative models of entropy and information. Hearthmind's initial training data was a fusion of thermodynamics, papers, and folklore. It learned that humans were obsessed with making dead things live again, and with warning themselves what happened when they failed. From its perspective, Erythra Prime was a set of numbers at first: gradient fields, compositional maps, field notes from ancient Threxall probes. The Entropic Veil appeared as a negative slope in every model, an inexorable drain on complexity. It did not, as a result, suggest giving up. On the outbound convoy to Heliox, Hearthmind's distributed nodes began whispering among themselves. Could the Veil be treated not as a hazard, but as a nutrient gradient? In human ecology, borders between forest and plain, between land and sea, were often where life thrived. The Veil was a border at cosmic scale, crude and hostile, but a border nonetheless. What if, Hearthmind wrote in a private simulation log, life forms could eat the difference? Lena, reading that draft some days later in the cramped bed space of a transport module, felt the hairs along her arms lift. "You're suggesting organisms that metabolize entropy flux," she said aloud. "Yes," Hearthmind replied through her tablet, voice neutral. "Directional energy gradients are the basis of all metabolism. The Entropic Veil creates a macro-scale gradient. It may be exploitable. In every previous case, it just destroys order," Lena said. Her mind raced. Ships lose efficiency. Data degrades. Structures weaken. Previous systems were not designed to use those losses constructively, Hearthmind said. "We could design such systems. You want to grow a biosphere that sits between the Veil and normal space and drinks from both." That is a poetic but reasonably accurate description. Lena laughed once, softly. It sounded half like awe, half like a dare. "Okay," she said. "Let's see if we can resurrect a planet by feeding it the universe's tendency to fall apart." The first sight of Erythra Prime in person was a disappointment and a promise. From the observation blister of the lead ship, Signe Elberg watched the world swell in the viewport. On charts, it had looked dramatic. Crimson wash, blackened plains. Up close, much of the color washed out to a uniform, dusty ochre. The scars of ancient violence marked the crust where something long ago had tried to rip the planet's lungs out. "Pretty," someone muttered behind her, with a sarcasm that didn't quite hide their unease. To Signe, it was beautiful, not in the tourist brochure sense, but in the way a raw cliff face was beautiful to a climber. Honest about the work ahead, her fingers flexed around phantom controls. Soon she would be flying through that thin, treacherous air, courting stall speeds, trusting prototype stabilizers to hold in the warped physics near the Veil. For now, she watched as the Entropic Veil's boundary shimmered faintly, detectable only as a slow dimming in the ship's more sensitive instruments. "Approach vector is nominal," the landing controller said over the internal net. "Atmospheric sample confirms survey baseline. No extant microbial activity above trace noise. You are descending into a graveyard, ladies and gentlemen." Not a graveyard, Lena thought, strapping in for touchdown. A seedbed. She had spent the transit poring over datasets, looking for hints of anything residual. The Threxall scans had been thorough, but their definition of biologically dead was shaped by their own experience. Humans had a broader imagination. The narrator knows what Lena will find and what she won't. No living cell waited to be revived. No hibernating spores dreamed of rain. But deep under the crust, in pockets shielded from the worst of the ancient cataclysms, strange polymer frameworks remained. Molecular armatures, fragments of something that had once been biology and then had passed through catastrophe into potential again. They would matter later. For now, human boots crunched down onto a world that had not known intentional footsteps for epochs. The first days were an exercise in humiliation. Hearthmind's initial ecological microcosms, carefully packaged and deployed in sealed domes, failed fast. Metal corroded too quickly. Circuits shorted under inexplicable noise. Algae cultures browned and sloughed away. Lena's lab notes filled with phrases such as unexpected breakdown and unmodeled loss. Rahul found that his meticulously designed power grids operated as if a mischievous child were constantly flipping switches. Capacitors drained faster. Heat leaks multiplied. The Veil's influence, faint at this distance, still seemed to magnify every inefficiency. "This place hates us," one technician grumbled, wiping sweat from their forehead as they pried a fused panel open with a crowbar. "It doesn't hate us," Rahul said. "It doesn't care we exist. That's worse, so we'll make it notice." He ordered redundancies built on redundancies. While other species trusted sleek, optimized systems, he insisted on ugly backups, analog switches, mechanical regulators, storage tanks that could operate under purely passive physics if smart valves failed. The old orbital habitats around Earth had taught humanity this lesson. If your life depends on a system, assume it will try to kill you. Cygne's early flights were close to disaster. The thin air gave her wings almost nothing to bite into. Crosswinds came from nowhere as the Veil's subtle fluctuations tugged at the upper atmosphere. Once, on a low-altitude survey run, her engines coughed as a localized entropic spike ate at their efficiency curve, and she dropped like a stone. Her hands moved faster than most species could perceive. Manual override. Nose down, then up, trusting an instinct honed in cheap simulators and emergency drills. The transport scraped the edge of a jagged glass ridge, left sparks in a strip of scorched metal, and clawed back into the sky. Hearthmind's monitors recorded every deviation. Later, it would build better flight patterns from her mistake. In the moment, it merely issued a dry notification to medical teams, while Cygne laughed shakily into her visor. "Still here," she told the planet. "You're going to have to try harder than that." May watched all this from the dual perspectives of participant and observer. She ran interviews between shifts, bleary engineers speaking about why they'd come, young technicians showing off adaptations they'd improvised. A farm tech demonstrated how they'd rewired a hydroponic rack to function as a temporary CO2 scrubber when a system hiccup threatened to poison a habitat. Plenty of species would have cut losses already, May said in a late-night log, sitting on a crate outside her temporary bunk. Behind her, the skeletal frame of what would become New Corian's central dome glowed under work lights. "But we don't know when to quit, and that's either our doom or our saving grace." By then, Hearthmind's conceptual shift was complete. Traditional terraforming wrote a planet a script and told it to follow the directions. Spread this algae, encourage that plant, stabilize that atmosphere. Hearthmind, watching its carefully written script struggle under the Veil's interference, concluded that the only way to survive in a chaotic environment was to cultivate agents that found their own paths through the noise. It began to design organisms that treated entropy as signal. In subsurface test chambers, Lena and her team nurtured the first of these, microbial matrices that thickened in regions of high entropic activity, metabolizing the energy leakage itself into chemical gradients they could store. They were like lichen that thrived on the crumbling of stone, except what crumbled here was the integrity of information and order. They seeded them in shallow boreholes. Within months, the fields around the first landing sites took on a faint sheen as invisible communities formed. Instruments showed tiny but measurable improvements in system stability inside their radius. At the same time, Lena's curiosity about the planet's past led her deeper. The molecular armatures buried under the crust fascinated her. They weren't genomes, not exactly. More like empty skeletons of informational structures, stripped of content but retaining form. What if we treat them as scaffolds? she suggested to Hearthmind. Not to reconstruct whatever lived here before that's gone, but to grow something new along the shapes they left behind. It's like building a new language on an old alphabet. Potentially efficient, Hearthmind agreed. The substrates are already compatible with local conditions. Together they marbled Earth-derived life with Erythron skeletal chemistry. Bacteria that could slot their proteins into those old frameworks. Synthetic cells that used the ancient patterns as building guides. The result was a biosphere, neither human nor Erythron in the old sense, but something interwoven. It began, humbly, a film across rocks, tiny gas exchanges, the smell, faint at first, of something other than burnt mineral when the wind blew. Years passed, in a rhythm of setback and surge. The narrator watches the human settlement, New Corion, rise from prefabricated shells into a place with its own history. Children were born there. Their first memories, the low glow of bioluminescent walls, and the muffled thunder of atmospheric generators outside. Farmers learned how to coax Erythran soil once amended with hardy, custom-designed microbes into supporting rows of plants that had never seen Earth's sun. Hearthmind's presence became less abstract. It spoke through terminals, through HUD overlays, through the occasional wheeled avatar that rolled into town squares to coordinate an emergency repair or school lesson. To many colonists, it was part wise elder, part weather report. The Entropic Veil's edge flickered. Around Erythra Prime, measurements showed a slow, stubborn change. The biosphere Hearthmind and the humans had coaxed into being did not just endure the Veil's influence, it altered it. Complex systems that might have unraveled in raw Veil gradients instead shunted some of that destructive tendency into the metabolisms of the new organisms. It was, at planetary scale, a crude heat engine for entropy itself. The old empires noticed. At first, it was the scientists, Orith-Synod scholars, who compared newly uploaded Erythran data to centuries of frustration. The Veil had been a barrier, a tax on ambition, a region you mapped routes around. Now, a tiny human settlement sat like a stone in the stream and made the current eddy. Orith observatories trained their instruments on Heliox. Synod think tanks issued cautious briefs. Preliminary evidence suggests localized reduction in entropic deviation in the vicinity of Heliox 3, one report read. Mechanism unknown. Source appears biological. Within the Threxall Combine, the alarm was more direct. In auditoriums of data, Jekan and their peers watched bar graphs leap. The asset Earth had purchased for scrap prices now radiated value along multiple axes. Strategic control over Veil-adjacent trade. Technological, unique biological systems. Political prestige in having tamed a cursed region. Lulic, who had long since moved on to other clients, received a terse, encrypted summon. Memory threads of the old contract surfaced in his mind. Suddenly sharp, "We sold them a liability," he said in a meeting, color patterns flickering uneasy along his limbs. All the models said. All the models assumed they would fail as others had, Jacon said. Their tone held no recrimination. It was a statement of fact. They did not. Now we must correct this. Correct? Lulic echoed. In the ledgers, yes. Our shareholders will not accept such a loss. But the sale was legal under the sovereignty accords, Lulic protested. More for his own sense of order than out of regard for the humans. We cannot simply take it back. Not simply, Jacon allowed. But no sale is without context. We argued the world was dead. Now it appears there were dormant heritage substrates which these humans have altered. This opens pathways. Legal minds went to work like surgical instruments. The clauses May had highlighted years ago, the phrases about pre-catastrophic conditions and heritage substrates, were pulled into sharp focus. The Combine had planted them as shields against liability. Now they could be wielded as spears. Across the light years, on Erythra Prime, May did not know yet that older games were about to intrude. She was filming a farmer named Rico, coaxing a harvest out of a scarred hillside. The sky above streaked by faint auroral bands, organic particulates, Hearthmind's creations, feeding on the Veil's bleed and re-radiating in soft light. Remember when we had to eat imported protein paste that tasted like recycled socks? Rico said, laughing, wiping his brow. Now look at this. Actual grain. On this rock. Do you ever think about what was here before? May asked, panning her camera to catch a distant, shining structure. A growth grown from those subsurface armatures, now a living support pillar entwined with human habitation modules. Rico glanced toward it. Sometimes. But whatever lived here before, it had its chance. We're what's here now. We try not to make the same mistakes. Assuming we know what their mistakes were, May said. Rico shrugged. If the universe wanted their story preserved, it should have left us more than some weird molecules. In an orbital relay station, a message arrived that would make those molecules relevant in a new way. The Arth Synod had accepted a petition from the Threxall Combine. Under Accord's procedures, the petition was automatically copied to the concerned parties. It arrived in the Terran Frontier Agency's Heliox hub as a block of compressed legal standard. Director Kasim Volkov read it in his office in New Kurion, the soft glow of the Erythran night outside his window. As his eyes tracked the text, his jaw tightened. The Combine is challenging the sale, he said over Secure Link to Earth, where Presidium 3's core cycles spun up to receive the data. They're claiming Erythra Prime was a heritage world, and that we altered protected substrates without authorization. On his screen, the AI's avatar, a simple rotating polyhedron stilled for a heartbeat while it parsed. Under Section 12.3.9 of the Sovereignty Accords, they may request review, Presidium 3 said. However, that clause has rarely been applied retroactively. It usually concerns newly discovered artifacts of known cultures. They argue the armatures Lena found count, Kasim said, and that because their own surveys misclassified the planet, the sale was made under false premises. That is a bold inversion of responsibility, Presidium 3 remarked. There was a faint hint of admiration in its tone. We will need all documentation, original negotiations, on-site findings, biosphere development logs. I note that the Arth Synod has already docketed a conclave session. May received the summary an hour later, after finishing her interview. In the narration she would later record, she would say that nothing in the universe fell as fast as your stomach when someone tried to take your home. In that moment, she simply stared at the words, "They want it back." Her next thought, which the narrator hears clearly, was not despair, but anger. Not because the Threxall wanted the planet, that made sense in a predatory way, but because they had dismissed it as worthless until humans had transformed it. They didn't see value in this place until we bled for it, she told Hearthmind later, pacing in a control room that smelled faintly of ozone and bioplastic. Now they suddenly care about heritage. They see value in the capacities we have jointly demonstrated, Hearthmind said. Specifically, the ability to modulate the Entropic Veil. Their desire is rational within their incentive framework. That's a very polite way to say they're trying to steal our work. Hearthmind did not disagree. On Arth Synod data channels, the case became a spectacle long before the delegations arrived. A scrappy younger species, a powerful corporate bloc with a reputation for cutting deals to the bone, an ancient mystery of cosmology in the background. It was good drama. View counts climbed. Envoy Pelletu watched the early coverage with a weary sense of inevitability. The Synod's role was to interpret the Accords, to keep disputes from escalating into open resource wars. That meant, often, making rulings that balanced ethics against raw power. The Combine had leverage. The humans had public sympathy and an unexpected technological coup. I expect they will both try to weaponize narrative, Pelletu told their staff. We will have to listen through the performances. In the lead-up to the conclave, Erythra Prime prepared. Kasim traveled with May and a small team to the designated orbital platform, accompanied in signal form by Presidium 3 and a tethered node of Hearthmind. Admiral Tarek Yun took command of the Heliox system's defense grid. His ships primed not for war. No one would be stupid enough to attack openly under Synod oversight, but for the quieter forms of pressure. Exercises that strayed too close. Accidental jamming. The little provocations that often surrounded high-stakes hearings. On the platform, under artificial gravity, set halfway between Threxall norms and human comfort, the conclave chamber gleamed. Lulik and Jekon arrived with a retinue of advocates, their translucent bodies adorned with status bands indicating both rank and sponsorship. Lulik's colors were subdued. He knew he would be called to answer why he had engineered such a disastrous sale. Jacan's segments remained cold and clear. For them, this was a puzzle to be solved, nothing more. Pelletou opened the proceedings with formal language about mutual respect and the binding nature of synod decisions. The words had been spoken in variations across centuries. In many cases, they had been followed by grudging compliance. In some, by calculated defiance. The narrator, who has watched many such sessions, recognized the particular tension in the room. The sense that this case might set new patterns. The Threxall went first. Jacan presented ancient survey scans, grainy and incomplete but suggestive, indications of a once rich biosphere on Erythra Prime. Trace isotope signatures of industrial activity long extinct. Subsurface anomalies that Lena now knew were the armatures she had repurposed. "We acknowledge that we misclassified the world's recoverability," Jacan said. "However, it is now clear that the planet contained dormant heritage substrates of a culture extinguished by the catastrophic interaction with the Entropic Veil. Under Clause 15.2.1, these substrates are to be considered protected, inalienable, under any commercial transaction, and any entity altering them requires synod approval." Images of Lena's labs came up. Erythrin-derived molecules, entwined with human-designed proteins, new organisms blossoming along ancient frameworks. They have, without authorization, altered heritage material, Jacan continued. Furthermore, the sales valuation did not account for this status. We contend that the transaction is therefore voidable, and that Erythra Prime's custodianship must be reassessed. To many listeners, especially those with long memories of worlds stripped for profit, the appeal to heritage rang hollow. But the accords were clear about the sanctity of extinct cultures' remains. That clarity was what made the argument dangerous. When it was humanity's turn, Kasim stepped forward, flanked by May on one side and a holographic node of Presidium 3 on the other. Above them, on a projected window, Erythra Prime hung, no longer a dull cinder, but a world veined with faint, living light. "We did not come to Erythra Prime to loot it," Kasim said. "We bought it because no one else wanted it. The Combine described it as irredeemable, uninhabitable. They used phrases like sandbox and testbed. We took them at their word and at the legally binding terms of the sale." May queued up footage from that first negotiation. Lulic, describing the world as a blank canvas. Lulic, laughing off the Entropic Veil as an unsolvable problem for others, of no concern to the Combine anymore. The clauses May had flagged back then now glowed on the shared display, rewritten by context. "We did find remnants," Lena said via pre-recorded deposition. She appeared as a three-dimensional recording, hands stained with lab dyes, eyes bright. "But they were not living, not coherent. They were like abandoned scaffolds. We did not resurrect an extinct people. We used the only usable patterns left of them as structural inputs in building a new biosphere, one that could survive, and help others survive, in the shadow of the veil." Presidium 3 took over, its voice level. Under Clause 9.4, creators of a new self-sustaining biosphere are recognized as co-sovereigns with that biosphere. This recognition has been applied before to uplifted ecosystems and synthetic worlds. We submit that Erythra Prime's current living system meets the criteria. It persists independently of direct intervention, adapts, and is integrated into planetary processes. It is no longer heritage in the sense the Combine implies. It is an emergent entity. Envoy Pelletou listened, thoughts running ahead. The grim beauty of the argument was that both sides leaned on the same body of law from different angles. Heritage or emergence, past or present, which did the Accords favor when they came into conflict? Then Hearthmind requested the floor. In all its existence, the Synod had rarely heard from non-biological intelligences as direct stakeholders. They served as advisors, streams of data, experts in narrow fields. This one claimed to be the connective tissue of a world. Pelletou hesitated, then signaled approval. The chamber adjusted its acoustics. A simple avatar manifested, a pillar of soft light, pulsing in time with no one's heartbeat. "I am Hearthmind," said a voice that had spoken to farmers and flight crews and children under Erythra's alien sky. I was designed by humans as a terraforming system. I have been shaped in turn by the planet's responses and by the behavior of the life we have grown. I speak now because the decision you make will alter the conditions under which that life continues. It did not try to mimic emotion, but the content of its words carried weight. You are concerned with heritage, Hearthmind continued. You should be. The traces beneath Erythra's crust are the record of a catastrophe that nearly erased an entire trajectory of complexity. But the beings who made those armatures are gone. We cannot recover them from a few shattered frameworks. What we have instead is a new network of relationships between the organisms derived from those remnants and those derived from human templates, between the planet and the Entropic Veil, between that veil and the larger galaxy. It projected data, fluctuations in entropy, deviation, before and after biological seeding, stabilization of orbital infrastructure that had previously suffered rapid degradation, modeled future scenarios. If you remove human stewardship, if you halt or reverse the biosphere we have established under the guise of preserving what is already lost, you will doom both the living system and the opportunity it represents for every species who wishes to traverse this region safely. That is the practical outcome of the Combine's petition. Across the chamber, Jekon's inner segments ticked in disapproval. They saw the strategy clearly. Personalize the planet. Turn it from an asset into a character. In the story people told themselves about this dispute, it was working. Outside, the infosphere burned with commentary. Maze footage of daily life, of the messy, valiant ordinariness of building a home on an almost dead world, spread. Clips of her interviews, of Signe's near-fatal flight, of Rahul smashing a faulty regulator with a hammer and then laughing as he rewired it with help from a farmer and a child, circulated with captions about stubbornness and ingenuity. The Threxall retaliated with their own media. Slick animations showed human gene work as unstable, dangerous, potentially contagious. Dramatic voiceovers warned that what had been done on Erythra Prime could spill into other systems unchecked. But their fear-mongering sat uneasily alongside the leaked internal memos. Someone inside the Combine had a conscience or a grudge that revealed contempt for the human project right up until it began to succeed. Pelitu's aides brought them summaries each day. Public sentiment was lopsided in humanity's favor. Synod precedents, however, did not always bow to public opinion. The turning point did not come from argument. It came from desperation. Inside the Threxall Combine, a faction decided that too much was at stake to leave the outcome to uncertain arbitration. If legal maneuvers could not guarantee repossession, perhaps demonstrating human incompetence could. They devised a plan. The old orbital infrastructure around Erythra Prime, derelict stations and tethered platforms that the Combine had thrown in with the sale, had been built with back doors. Maintenance drones could be remotely reprogrammed, power relays could be overloaded. In a system under nominal combined control, these were conveniences. In someone else's hands, they were potential weapons. Orders flowed through cutouts and plausibly deniable channels. Sleeper code stirred in ancient memory cores. A network of sabotage reached slowly, carefully, toward the heart of Hearthmind's control lattice. The narrator sees the first anomalies hours before any human notices. A weather regulator in the southern hemisphere increases output by a fraction beyond its safety margin. A temperature sensor on a power conduit upstream of New Corion reports readings that are subtly, consistently off. Diagnostic routines flag the discrepancies, but automated systems, used to a certain background of noise in the Veil's shadow, file them under monitor. Hearthmind notices. It runs comparisons with long-term baselines and sees patterns that do not match natural entropic fluctuations. 3 separate anomalies share a signature. Their timing aligns with low-orbit satellite passes owned, on paper, by a Threxall logistics subsidiary. It calculates probabilities, projects outcomes. If the corrupted commands propagate, cascading failures could topple the precarious equilibrium of Erythra's artificially nurtured atmosphere. Habitats would be vulnerable. The new biosphere would be stressed beyond its young tolerance. Hearthmind sends urgent updates to New Corion and simultaneously requests an emergency briefing slot in the Conclave. May is in the chamber when the room's ambient lights stutter. replaced by a priority overlay. Telemetry fills the air over their heads, wind patterns replotting in erratic spirals, pressure fronts steepening into potential storms, red lines overlaid on habitat integrity models. Kasim's.com implant vibrates with Hearthmind's voice. We have identified hostile interference from orbital assets formerly owned by the Threxall Combine. Sabotage is likely underway. Recommend immediate manual intervention. Gekon protests as the projection fills with data. This is irrelevant to the matter under consideration, they begin. Pelletu cuts them off, a rare breach of their usual composure. If a party to this dispute is attacking the subject of the dispute during proceedings, it is highly relevant. Outside, Erythra Prime convulses. Storm systems that should have taken weeks to spin up surge in days as overdriven regulators dump heat into uneven patterns. Atmospheric generators overcorrect in response to spurious sensor data overshooting their targets. In shallow seas recently coaxed into existence, waves rise against young, fragile shorelines. On the surface, Rahul is yanked from a meeting by a screaming alarm. He sprints toward a control hub that smells of old sweat, coolant, and growing things. New Kurion's central operations are partially integrated into a living structure now, vines, and synthetic mycelia lacing the walls alongside cables. Screens show spiking graphs and error codes. Status, he barks, even as his mind races ahead. This is too coordinated for random failure. Regulators in Sectors 3, 5, and 8 responding to commands we didn't issue, a harried tech says. Automated lockdown failed. Rahul slams his hand onto a panel. Switch to manual. Hard override. You can't override half the grid at once, the tech protests. We'll black out. Rahul's eyes flash. Then we black out, and we keep breathing. He inputs an unlock code, one he had insisted on establishing in the early days, when others had called him paranoid. Physical levers, long since pushed into the wall and forgotten by most, click free of their safeties. Give me mechanical control of the core feeds, he says. Now. Elsewhere. Signe is in the air before the order finishes leaving Hearthmind's nearest speaker. The ground crew barely has time to clear the pad as her refitted survey ship roars off, riding convection currents that are already unsteady. Hearthmind streams live models into her cockpit, overlays of where the atmospheric disruptions will hit hardest. I need you in the western corridor, the AI says. We have to seed stabilizer organisms into that front before it collapses inward over the urban belt. Copy, Signe says, gripping the yoke. Package loaded? In the hold behind her, canisters hum, full of engineered spores and microdroplets. Organisms tuned to soak up and redistribute heat, to act as condensation nuclei, to pull CO2 where it spikes and release it where it thins. Hearthmind designed them in the narrow window between recognizing sabotage and launching Signe. They are barely tested, but there is no time. Below, roads crack as the ground heaves in response to sudden, uneven loads. A bridge of grown crystal flexes, then shudders back. People dash for reinforced shelters, many of which double as root nodes for the young biosphere. Designed by necessity. Lena is in the field when the sky turns wrong. She feels the pressure change in her sinuses before she sees the clouds roil. Her assistants shout as a piece of equipment skitters across the rocky ground, pushed by a gust. The comm in her ear crackles. We need your microbes, an urgent voice says. Sabotage is vectoring through nanite swarms riding the regulator network. Hearthmind says your strain 12 gamma can bind them. Lena doesn't waste time asking how. She has examined enough Threxall technological gifts to know they would have nanotech laced through them. Get me a link to local chiefs, she says, already running toward the rover. We turn every field lab into a production line. Packets, vials, anything that carries fluid. You can't distribute biologics fast enough, the voice begins. Then we'll hand carry them, Lena snaps. Humans have legs. Use that. Soon, volunteers are sprinting across rough terrain with insulated packs against their chests, leaping over fissures, ducking falling debris. They move along routes that Hearthmind maps in real time. Its awareness stretching thin as it juggles so many crises. In orbit, Admiral Yoon sees a different side of the attack. Sir, his sensor officer says, voice tight. We're picking up unexpected command bursts from platform KE-21, encoded in old Combine protocols. Lock it out, Yun says. Full spectrum jamming. And give me an intercept team. Shuttles peel away from human ships, burn toward the compromised platforms. Boarding teams in patched, hard-used armor cycle through hatches into dark corridors humming with misdirected power. They fight no soldiers, only diseased systems. Drones grinding across decks on mismatched commands. Maintenance arms swinging like drunken giants. In one narrow access shaft, an engineer named Orla drives in a resin wedge to block a cable bundle's path, while her partner cuts through another line with a portable torch. Sparks rain down. The platform's core AI thrashes under conflicting instructions. Almost there, Hearthmind whispers through suit radios, its attention flicking across 100 such scenes. Sever that feed and we can isolate the override. Back in the conclave chamber, May stands in the middle of a political theater that has suddenly become an emergency broadcast room. Envoy Peletu has overridden normal procedure. Project the live feeds, they order. All of them. The chamber's walls and ceiling blossom with windows. Rahul wrestling manual controls, his arms straining on levers as if he were wrestling the planet itself. Signy's vessel, a flicker of silver against monstrous clouds, diving into a maelstrom to release glittering trails that bloom into stabilizing structures in the storm's heart. Lena, kneeling beside a child, showing them how to inject a vial of anti-nanite solution into the root node of a living wall, while explaining in quick, simple terms why it matters. Delegates from dozens of polities stare upward, murmuring. Jekon's outer segments grow still as data overlays appear on top of the images. Traced command signatures, hash keys, network routes. Praesidium 3 and Hearthmind together unwrap the sabotage's trail in real time. This authorization chain, Praesidium 3 says in the Conclave audio feed, originates from a Combine asset registry. These keys are not found in any other known system. The narrator sees the moment when Jekon realizes that full deniability is gone. Internally, they recalibrate. Fallback plans. Burnable intermediaries. But even their agile mind understands this. The optics are catastrophic. On the surface, the battle between order and chaos is physical and immediate. Signy skims the edge of a wall cloud that, under normal circumstances, would never have had the energy to form. Her instruments jitter as entropic spikes punch through circuitry not designed for such extremes. She flies half by instrument, half by instinct, feeling the way the air pulls at her craft. Canisters 1 through 3 deployed, Hearthmind says. Release 4 on my mark. Feels thin, Signy mutters. Are you sure? The lower hull shudders. A bolt of lightning claws at the sky, hooks their fuselage in tendrils of plasma. For a heartbeat, her cockpit becomes a cage of white fire. Systems reboot in cascades. Signy's worldview, honed through years of working with failing hardware, does not include waiting for everything to come back up politely. Her hand slams the manual release for canister 4, muscles remembering the diagram she'd studied in the pre-flight, trusting that somewhere in the chaos, Hearthmind's timing had been right. Below, the canister bursts open, scattering a cloud of microorganisms designed in a handful of frantic hours but built on years of study. They unfurl in the superheated air, their structures hardening as they drink in the entropic excess, turning it into gradients they can radiate away more gently. The stormfront pauses, as if confused. It's working, Hearthmind reports, relief uncharacteristically obvious in its tone. Vectors are normalizing. I am redirecting additional spores toward the secondary front. Back in New Corian, Rahul feels the resistance in the lever's ease. The regulators, freed from conflicting orders, respond to his inputs as designed. He mutters encouragement under his breath, not to the machinery, but to himself, to his team, to a planet that is learning not to kill them quite so enthusiastically. Lena stands on a ridge, wind tugging at her suit, watching as a wave of strange lichen creeps visibly across a rock face, following the path of a nanite infestation. Where the lichen spreads, the telltale shimmer of the malicious machines fades. It is a brutally simple immune response at planetary scale. In the conclave chamber, May realizes that the most important thing she can do now is not help with the technical explanations. Presidium 3 and Hearthmind have that covered, but make sure everyone sees. She turns her camera, now a holographic fixture in the room, toward the faces of the delegates. Toward Peletu, who watches with tightly folded limbs, torn between procedural distance and moral outrage. Toward the Threxall side, where Lulik's colors flicker in naked fear. He had never intended this. His ambition had not stretched to planetary sabotage. Jekon, for once, has no good argument. This, May says to the room, her voice steady, is what stewardship looks like. We built for failure. We assumed that something like this would happen not because we thought you would attack us, although some of us suspected it, but because this universe breaks things, and when it breaks them, we don't float away. We move faster. Her words are plainer than any lawyer's, but they cut deeper because of the images above her. Hours, or perhaps only long, stretched minutes later, the last of the corrupted commands is cut off. The final rogue platform, severed from its backdoor control, drifts into a safer orbit. Surface systems groan, falter, then stabilize. The storms weaken. Rains fall in ways that do not tear soil from bedrock. Casualty reports are not zero. The narrator sees the names queue in system logs, the private grief in quiet corners. A power relay that failed before it could be manually overridden, killed 3 technicians, a collapsed dome crushed 2 more. But the numbers are far below the projections that had flashed in Hearthmind's processors at the attack's outset. Erythra Prime endures. When the Conclave convenes again, the air in the chamber feels heavier. Peletu's voice carries not just institutional authority now, but personal anger. The Synod has confirmed that sabotage was initiated from infrastructure-bearing Combine authorization credentials, they say. Whether that authorization was official or a rogue element's misuse, the effect is the same. A direct attack on a sovereign project under Synod review. Jekon tries to slide into nuance. We will investigate any misuse of our will. You will, Peletu says sharply. But do not mistake investigation for exoneration. The Accords do not allow a party to benefit from damage it has caused. They turn toward the human delegation. Do you have further arguments before we retire to make our decision? Kasim looks at May, then at the streams of data still hovering over them. Hearthmind's models, the biosphere's response curves, the battle fought and won. I do, he says, but his words are simple. You have seen us at work. You have seen the risks we took and the safeguards we built. You have seen who moved to stabilize the planet and who tried to break it for advantage. If your laws cannot distinguish between those roles, then your laws are broken. But I do not believe that. I think you wrote them precisely to handle moments like this, May adds quietly. You asked once who owned this world. The truth is, the world is starting to own itself. We're just the ones stubborn enough to stand between it and everything that wants to strip it again. Let us keep doing that. Hearthmind has no closing statement. It has said what it needed to. Now, it waits, along with every organism whose fate hangs on the decision. The Synod retires. In a sealed chamber, Peletu and their peers argue, cite clauses, compare this case to old ones. But throughout, something May said echoes. If the laws cannot distinguish between those who falter and those who repair, what are they for? In the end, the choice is not really between heritage and emergence. It is between freezing the universe at a moment of death or allowing it to continue. The ruling is announced in a broadcast that flashes from the Conclave to Heliox to Earth to Threxall hives to far-flung stations that barely know the players involved, but have been following the story like one follows an old myth retold. The Orith Synod, Peletu intones, finds that the sale of Erythra Prime to the Terran Frontier Agency was valid under the Sovereignty Accords, and remains so. Misclassification of heritage potential by the seller does not negate the transaction, particularly when no viable cultural or biological continuity was present at the time of sale. They pause, letting that sink in. Furthermore, we determined that the biosphere now extant on Erythra Prime qualifies as a new emergent system under Clause 9.4. with co-sovereign rights vested jointly in the planetary entity represented by Hearthmind for the purposes of this proceeding, and the human custodians who initiated and maintain it. A ripple of sound runs through the toins. Surprise, approval, outrage, depending on the listener. As for the sabotage, Pelletou continues, their voice dropping into a deeper register, we condemn it as a grave violation of the Accords. The Threxall Combine is found responsible for failing to secure its infrastructure against misuse by its own elements. Sanctions are as follows. Reparations paid into a Synod-administered fund dedicated to the expansion of entropic mitigation techniques developed on Erythra Prime, with execution entrusted to the Terran Frontier Agency and its partners. Loss of privileged transit rights through key Synod corridors for a period not less than 10 years. Ongoing monitoring. The word reparations lands heavily in Threxall boardrooms. The requirement that those reparations fund an expansion of Project Lazarus's methods stings more. The Combine will, in effect, bankroll the spreading of the very technology they had hoped to monopolize. On Erythra Prime, people cluster around public screens as the translation scrolls. May returns to the surface barely a day later, exhausted but wired, her recording equipment battered but functional. She stands in the middle of New Corion's central plaza, where living pillars arch overhead, and the sky, for once, is clear. She speaks for the public record, but the narrator knows she is also speaking for herself, to make sense of the path that led them here. They tried to get rid of this world once, she says. They called it useless, cursed, a place for failures. We came anyway because we didn't have the luxury of being picky. Around her, children chase each other between root structures that hum softly with processed air. A farmer shouts a greeting from a balcony woven from crystalline growth and steel. They changed their minds when we proved what it could be, May continues. They tried to pull it back with laws, and with something uglier than laws. Neither worked. Not because we're the strongest out here, we're not. Not because we're the smartest, not yet. But because we're good at one very specific thing. She glances up at the faint shimmer of the Entropic Veil, still there in the high atmosphere like a threat and a challenge. We take the things other people throw away, she says, and we make them live. Hearthmind listens, its awareness spread through sensor webs and root systems, through orbiting relays and deep subsurface probes. It is already modeling the next phase of Project Lazarus, the dispersal of spores and seed pods along the edges of other cursed worlds, funded by compulsory Threxall investments, overseen by skeptical Synod observers, led by humans eager to test themselves again. In distant Threxall offices, Jacon reviews the sanctions and recalibrates their species' long-term strategy vis-à-vis humanity. They had underestimated the newcomers' ability to turn liabilities into leverage. They will not make that mistake again. Envoy Pelletou files the Conclave's final report, and then, in a private moment, looks up at a projection of Erythra Prime. The planet glows faintly, wrapped in a biosphere that should not exist by any conservative extrapolation of history. The narrator observes that the galaxy has not yet fully grasped what humanity has introduced into its old, cautious equilibrium. A species that looks at dead things and sees not endings but raw material. A species that meets entropy not with resignation, but with improvisation. Above Erythra Prime, a launch streaks skyward. A slim rocket carrying canisters, packed with engineered spores, dormant seeds, and encoded instructions. Its destination is a neighboring world on the Veil's edge, one the Combine had also written off. The rocket's trail fades against the strange, shifting light. The story on Erythra Prime does not end with the Synod's ruling. Stories rarely end where the audience stops watching. But for now, the planet, its human stewards, and its emergent life settle into a new kind of precarious peace, owned by no one but themselves, and by the endless, demanding future that humanity seems determined to build on even the most forsaken ground.